welcome to today's Green Roads webinar. This is number 23 in our series, and so far going strong. I'm Ian Greenwood, and I'll be your moderator or host for today. As a consultant who works extensively with both the World Bank and the ADB, it's certainly a pleasure to moderate a session where we get to have our counterparts at the World Bank and their consultants sharing their ideas with us. Great to have this collaboration. For people outside of the ADB and World Bank may not be aware of just how much the two do actually work alongside each other and share good ideas. Before I introduce today's session, though, just to let you know that we're back here again next week. That's session number 24 on low carbon emission concrete for walkways and paths. I like to think of that as essentially how do we make a green mode of transport even greener. We'll then pick up again after the Easter break with a timely presentation by Gordon Keller. Gordon was one of the authors of the ADB Green Roads Toolkit, so he gets to present number 25, which seems like a nice number, and that'll be on biodiversity. For now, though, it's my pleasure to welcome you to the webinar on leveraging satellite data for resilient and climate-friendly infrastructure, with the aim to explore research on how satellite data can be used to support recovery for climatic shocks and monitor resilient infrastructure. We've seen with a number of our webinars the role that big data sets is playing in the provision of infrastructure. And this time we're certainly pushing that limit of big by moving into outer space examination of events in Pakistan, Mozambique and Senegal. We have three speakers today, and they've kindly agreed to battle time zones from various parts of the world to talk to us. First up is Tillman von Kana, who's the Assistant Professor in Departments of Economics at the University of Oslo. Tillman works on the economics of remote rural areas with a focus on the use of high-frequency satellite imagery. Prior to his current position, he completed his PhD at the Stockholm University, as well as completing postdoc studies at Stanford. Second speaker, Rob Marty, who's a data scientist in the Development Impact Group within the World Bank. Rob supports project evaluations, impact evaluations of transport investments, including road corridors, urban mobility, and road safety. In particular, his work focuses on leveraging innovative data sources for impact evaluations, such as satellite imagery, crowdsourced data, and private sector data sources. He holds a Master of Science in Computational Operations Research and a Master of Public Policy from the College of William and Mary in Virginia. And thirdly, we have Marion Sagot, who is also in the Development Impact Group of the World Bank. Marion supports the bank portfolio on impact evaluation in Senegal, Mauritania, Guinea-Bissau, and the Gambia, with a focus on infrastructure and climate change investments. Marion joined the World Bank based in Senegal to support large transport infrastructure impact evaluation using innovative data sets. She holds a master's degree in public policy and a development from Toulouse School of Economics and a BSc in sociology. She's also currently facing challenges with a video camera on her computer, so we may not be able to see her, but she's certainly there and is alive and kicking. As is normal practice, please submit your questions via the Q&A box at the bottom of the screen, and we'll get to those at the end of the session. At some stage, Mark will also be sharing a link to a feedback form. You're welcome to complete at any time. And with that, I'll pass the floor over to Tillman. It's all yours.
Thanks a lot, Ian, for the introduction. Let me share. Yeah, thanks for having me. I'll be presenting a project that is really a team effort between people at the World Bank in the DIME unit and Anna Thompson at Stockholm University and myself. And we're looking at a program in northern Mozambique that upgraded rural roads, and we're asking whether this improved market access and enabled agricultural intensification. Let's jump right in. So this is a project in Africa where less than 50% of people live within 2 kilometers of an all-season road. And it's commonly believed that high transport costs are also behind the observed low agricultural productivity. And as many of you will know, I guess I'm preaching to the choir here. There's a lot of interest from governments and donors to invest both in larger roads and more reliable ones that can also work during rainy seasons or withstand climatic shocks. But the evidence base on this from an economic perspective is actually relatively thin, precisely the evidence base on how long these roads can last and how long and how transformation of their impacts can actually be for agriculture. The reason for that is not because it's not interesting, but rather because it's really hard to study quantitatively. Roads are expensive to build, and so there's never going to be a lot of them, which is difficult from a quantitative perspective, or they are built to areas that are expected to grow anyway. So it's difficult to find the right and construct the right counterfactuals. And as a result, much of the evidence that we have either comes from relatively larger roads, such as highways, from relatively richer contexts than the ones we're studying, or is simply using a measure of 0, 1, does this place have a road or not, and ignores the issue of road quality. So that's where we want to contribute. Much of the stuff that I'll present to you today is going to be relatively preliminary, but I hope it can give an overview of the kinds of data we have collected and the kinds of questions we're interested in. So if this is of interest to you, please feel free to reach out afterwards. So we're interested in 3 main questions, namely whether the upgrading of these roads affected their quality in both in the short run and medium and longer run, and their reliability, especially in times of heavy rains and floods. Do better roads actually allow the people living along those roads to access markets? That's not a trivial question in our context because people typically don't have their own mode of transport. And does the program as intended by the policymaker actually increase the intensity of agricultural land use and thereby stimulate agricultural production? The context for this project is a World Bank funded program in northern Mozambique where the local road authority selected out of a larger pool of eligible roads about 105 roads that were then upgraded. So you can see an example of the kinds of roads we're talking about at baseline on the right here. So there are big problems with erosion, encroachment of vegetation, and often these roads are more like paths and very narrow. After the upgrades, they are wide and designed to carry relatively heavy vehicles. So this program is particularly useful for us to evaluate because it allows us to compare outcomes along the selected roads to non-selected roads, and that's the main identification strategy that I'll be using today. A specific feature of this program is that it takes place over a long time. The upgrades were implemented over the span of 3 years. And to capture the effects of the program, we are making an effort to collect data that also spans a long period, both before and after the program, after the actual construction work. And that's where satellite imagery comes in particularly handy. Just to show one map and to fix ideas, this is northern Mozambique, 2 provinces, Nampula and Zambezia. And within those provinces, 10 districts were selected. And within those districts, eligible roads were mapped. So that's the orange and green ones here, where the green ones were ultimately selected according to a prioritization score, and the orange ones were not. It's important to note that these roads here that we're talking about are really last mile feeder roads that connect from the primary and secondary and tertiary network to remote villages. So the main roads in this area here, the only paved roads in this area are these thick black lines here, and then from that thinner secondary and tertiary roads into the districts, and the roads we're studying are even smaller than those. So how can one study such a program, given that it takes place over such a large area and that it takes a long time? For this, we decided to combine, or we understood that sort of a traditional household survey wouldn't be feasible, but we decided to combine on-the-ground data collection using teams of enumerators that travel by motorbike with satellite data. And with those questions, and with those data, we want to answer these three questions. For the first question, sort of perhaps a scary one to an engineer, but still I think an important one to answer is whether these roadworks actually improve roads and for how long. We're first using imagery to actually detect when those roads were upgraded. And then our main measure of road quality is going to be how fast our teams of enumerator can travel along those roads, both the upgraded ones and the not upgraded ones. Do they increase access to markets? As I said, that is largely a question of how much transport there is available for people. So we're asking our enumerators to record traffic as they travel along those roads, according to different vehicle categories. And we're specifically looking at the marketplaces in those areas, so places where people meet to trade, and we can use satellite imagery to track how many people are attending those markets over time, and that will give us an indication about the opportunities for trade that people have. And thirdly, for agriculture intensification, this is a context where the use of modern inputs is very low at baseline. So the main margin where one could expect adjustments is along land use or the share of land used for agriculture. And that's again something we're measuring with satellites and collecting validation data on the ground. Okay, so let me jump into some preliminary results. Yeah. First on the road upgrades. This is something that ideally, of course, we would have liked to get from the implementer, but it was hard for us to tease that data out of project reports. So instead, we decided to delve into trying to construct the road construction data from sort of primary data. As you can see on the left, these upgrades leave a really distinct signal in satellite imagery, where once the road is widened and resurfaced, it stands out as this clearly visible orange line. And so doing that across all roads in our sample, we get this distribution of upgrade dates that line up generally with what we hear from the implementer, but that allow us to pin down per road when this road was upgraded. Then secondly, on the travel speeds along those roads, this figure shows average speeds that our enumerators could attain across 4 categories of roads. On the left, again, the project roads, either selected or not selected, and on the right, larger roads that were either paved or unpaved, so the black lines in the previous map. And as you can see, it appears that selected roads generally had larger speeds than not selected ones. Part of that was already true before the implementation of the upgrades. But as the upgrades progressed, that's these thinner bars with the year numbers on them, travel speeds generally increased. I think there are 2 interesting points about this. One is that the speeds that were now attainable on these really small roads or last mile roads are actually substantially higher than the average speed on these unpaved secondary roads. So in parts of the program, what happened was that last mile roads were upgraded for heavy vehicle transport, whereas the roads actually leading to those smaller roads remained in a relatively bad state and were at least more costly to travel over for heavy transport. And the second interesting point I think that we may be seeing some evidence for is perhaps a beginning of a decay in road speed again. So I think it will be very interesting to collect this data going forward and see for how long essentially this increase in travel speeds is sustained until the roads erode and degrade again. Regarding market access and availability of transport, this plot shows for the same kinds of road categories traffic counts for 4 different categories of vehicles. In the top row, four-wheel transport, like chappas are the local minibus and cars. You can see that traffic flows or flows of those vehicles are extremely low on the kinds of roads that we're studying, at about 1 or 2 per hour at most, and very rarely these sort of public transport vehicles. But the dominant mode of transport is two-wheeled, so bikes and bicycles. And for those, we also see an increase in the number of vehicles that travel on these roads. I won't be able to show you results on changes in market activity, but just as an illustration of what this data or what this analysis will be about and what one can do with it. A lot of the trade in this region happens at weekly markets that are sort of at fixed locations on a fixed day of the week where people come to trade, and those markets are visible and detectable and visible in satellite imagery, and we can track their activity over time. So next time I'll be presenting this, I hope I can show you results on how market activity reacted both along the upgraded roads and along the non-upgraded roads. And then on agriculture intensification, as I said, this is a context where agriculture is done at relatively low intensity at baseline. You can see in some examples here on the right how fields are typically prepared manually. They are interspersed with natural vegetation, and generally low levels of fertilizer use and improved seed use. So it seems reasonable to believe that if people do respond to better market opportunities, they would take more land under cultivation or farm that land more consistently. That seems to be something you can measure well with satellite imagery again, but as previous literature, we found that the existing products that people often use don't fit very well for this context. And that's because those products are really geared towards detecting or distinguishing between virgin rainforest and large-scale plantations, which is clearly not the context we're looking at here. Instead, we used Sentinel-2 imagery to derive locally tailored land classification that we can validate with data collected by our enumerators. And we found that this performs a lot better than what we could get or could have gotten off the shelf. Here's just an illustration of this, where in the top row you see 3 places in our study districts in high-resolution satellite imagery, and in the bottom row, superimposed on those, classification where red pixels are ones where our algorithm says those are fields, and green pixels are ones where it says those are not fields. And you can see it's doing, I think, an impressive job at even picking and distinguishing between sort of small clusters of bushes and trees. So then to some results, again, this will not be on the actual project on the distinction between selected and not selected roads, but rather on a previous exercise that we did, which started from the idea that river crossings are particularly vulnerable parts of the road network in our context. And because they are not crossable during times of floods or because they get washed away during the rainy seasons, they represent really discrete jumps in market access. So someone who lives on the close side of a river, as seen from a town, may have an easy time reaching their town, or much easier time reaching their town than someone who lives on the far side of the river. So if then land use is actually constrained by market access, if the reason that people are not using the land more intensively is because of a lack of market access, we should see differences in land use at these crossings. And that's what we explore with our land cover classification data, where the results are summarized in this plot here. We identified about 600 crossings in our study area and ranked the banks of each crossings by whether they were relatively close to a town or relatively far from a town. And you see on the right here in this, on the left in this panel, a visualization of differences in land use across these crossings, where on the left you have the areas relatively close to towns and on the right areas relatively far. And if market access actually constrained land use, then you would expect a jump at these crossings. We don't find very much here. If anything, summarized here on the right, you can perhaps see a trend of higher land use or higher differences in land use across these crossings in areas that are relatively close to markets, but not in areas that are more remote from existing cities where road infrastructure actually is also worse. So overall, this suggests that perhaps, if anything, we would expect responses to better roads and more reliable infrastructure in those areas that are relatively close to towns, but not so much in areas that are far away. So let me analyze a feeder road program in northern Mozambique, and preliminarily we find that those roads, those upgrades actually enabled higher travel speeds, but often sort of not in a way that integrated those remote areas with higher quality roads higher up the ranking of roads. There's increased traffic along those upgraded roads, mostly relatively light vehicles, and so far we have limited evidence for increased agricultural land use. Methodologically, we have learned during this project that a combination of ground collected and remotely sensed data really enables the evaluation of such a program in a context where we couldn't rely on administrative data or other sort of traditional sources of data. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Tillman. And then we'll carry on to Rob. I think you're next.
Perfect. Let me go ahead and share my screen. Okay. Perfect. So this presentation is leveraging big data, particularly satellite imagery, but also other private sector data to look at the impact and recovery from the large floods that happened in Pakistan in 2022. And this is this is a project that's part of the iConnect for Impact program within the World Bank. And the iConnect program is part of the Development Impact Evaluation group at the World Bank that leverages kind of like data impact evaluation that uses data, new technologies to inform policy decisions and investments and transport, primarily through kind of like impact evaluation and leveraging different kind of big data tools. We have projects ranging from everything from urban mobility to corridors, road safety, rural roads, gender, and kind of lots of sectors. So again, presenting just kind of one of the projects in this portfolio. But again, like throughout the projects, we often think about leveraging these kind of like new and different data sources to look at the impact of transport on different outcomes. This project again is focusing on the large floods that happened in Pakistan in 2022. We're just, I mean, kind of like the reports that we have that there was exceptionally heavy monsoons that happened starting around June of 2022 that led to exceptional flooding throughout the country, where estimates indicate there was about 700 deaths, about 8 million displaced, 2.1 million homes destroyed, and 3 billion in damages. So quite extensive flooding and damages that we kind of know happen. And then, so the goal of this project is to leverage different geospatial data, particularly satellite imagery and different private sector data sources to understand the impact and recovery at a particularly granular geospatial scale that can inform understanding which locations in particular experience kind of like the heaviest damages and to inform how recovery has happened even to date. So to do this, so just kind of a quick outline, I'll give an overview of the data and first give a descriptive analysis of the damages on floods using the different indicators from the different data sources. We'll show some preliminary evidence looking at the impact of floods on socioeconomic outcomes, and then show some specific analysis of thinking about how we leverage the data to look at the impact of floods on road infrastructure and how we can think about leveraging the data to kind of like target road improvements. So first on the data side, so we're going to leverage nighttime lights, which is a common proxy used for economic activity. We're leveraging data from the VIIRS Black Marble data set, which is a 500-meter resolution, where we have everything from kind of like daily to annual data since 2012. And again, this is kind of a bit more of a now a common metric that used in the literature. So we use this in combination with a couple other sources. So first, not on the satellite imagery side, but we use data from Mapbox Movement, which is an activity index derived from mobile phone data, where we have this data at 100-meter resolution, and we have this data monthly starting in January 2022. And then we also are using a relatively newer data set from Google that's derived from satellite imagery. That's the Google Open Buildings temporal data set that provides information on both like the presence and also the height of buildings at a 4-meter resolution. And this starts annually from 2016. So these are some of the main data sets we use to look at outcomes of the flooding, and then to kind of like capture flooding, we're also using kind of a radar-based imagery from Sentinel to kind of like describe the presence of flooding as well. So again, it's kind of both a combination of satellite imagery and different kind of like big private sector data sources. So first, just get a sense for the magnitude of flooding. This is showing precipitation data, where we see particularly in the regions of Sindh and Balochistan especially, just all significantly higher average precipitation in 2022, which led to the extensive flooding. And then just kind of like maps showing as well, again, Sindh was among the hardest hit regions. It's the region in kind of like the southeast, more or less. Again, the map is showing that the extensive flooding that happened primarily in June to October of 2022. So it's going to be kind of like the target period that we look at to look at impacts. Then we can look at later dates to get a sense for kind of how things have recovered since the flooding. So first, just leveraging the data for some descriptive analysis to get a sense for how the flood impacted the different outcome metrics that we're able to capture. So the first, we're using changes in nighttime lights. And what the map on the left is showing is the nighttime lights from before and after the floods, where we see just kind of like throughout the country, seeing kind of what's shown in red, which is a reduction in nighttime lights. And on the right, looking at data from during the floods to after, where we're starting to see kind of like recovery in nighttime lights as well. So again, just kind of like some quick descriptive stats from nighttime lights, showing that we can use nighttime lights to kind of capture both reductions of lights that we saw during the floods, but also kind of like recovery after. And this is just focused on the Sindh region of Pakistan, which is among the more heavily impacted regions here. And then here showing changes in building height. So what the graph on the left is showing is growth before the floods. This is trends from 2019 to 2021, where we see just kind of like growth and expansion of buildings throughout Sindh. And then on the right, we're comparing 2021 to 2023, so the year after the floods, which shows damages and a reduction of building heights throughout Sindh. So again, just kind of like showing the damages that we can kind of capture from satellite imagery. And here's a graph looking at Mapbox activity that's looking at activity throughout the flooding period, just kind of like right after the flooding period, where it's showing the changes in activity, again, just focus on Sindh. So we're able to see the regions that saw a reduction, and then, but also some regions that saw an increase in activity, potentially suggesting that, kind of people are going from more affected regions to less effective regions from activity. And then just with the activity data, one of the nice things is it is super granular. We get the data at 100-meter resolution, and we're able to track the specific locations that saw decreases, increases, or locations that saw no change in activity. So here, just kind of like zooming in right on Karachi, which is kind of within the Sindh region, and we're able to identify specific types of locations that saw different changes. So we identify kind of types of locations or open street maps, and combining with the activity index, we're able to get a sense for like what are the specific, again, types of locations that saw like increases and decreases. So we see increases activity in particularly kind of among hospitals, but among the more kind of residential areas like apartments, house, and residential, those are the types of locations where we see more of a reduction in activity, which I kind of and then beyond building types, we also look at specific types of roads. So we can see the activity index kind of outlining specific roads. So we can also use that to get a sense for which roads may have seen an increase or a reduction in activity, where reduction kind of potentially help inform damaged roads as well, where if you're just kind of like ceasing to see activity, particularly after the flooding period. So in this analysis, we're able to show that larger roads tend to see a reduction or an increase in increase or relatively no change in activity, but it's these more smaller roads such as secondary or tertiary that's going to see a non-trivial reduction in activity, which is suggesting damages of these roads, especially for roads that just kind of go from some activity to just kind of no activity after the flooding period. So moving kind of from this more descriptive analysis, we do leverage a difference in difference analysis to look at the impacts of flooding. So here we're using a data set from the global human settlement layer that identifies main cities throughout the country, and we're able to kind of like tag different cities as affected by floods versus the locations that weren't affected by floods. And here we're just using a simple difference in difference design where here, I mean, like treatment is just whether the city was impacted by the floods, or then post is just the period after the flooding, where our pre-period is in May 2022 before flooding happened. And we define post as both during the flooding period, but then we also look at periods in the months kind of immediately after, and then just further following the flooding period as well. And then we use this strategy as well to interact this kind of difference in difference coefficient with whether the location was above or below median nighttime lights to get a sense for impacts larger or smaller in areas that had higher initial nighttime lights. So just kind of had larger initial economic activity. And what we find just kind of like from the main results is that we see kind of a clear reduction in nighttime lights, which is from the flooding, both in the monthly and the annual data. And when we interact this with baseline nighttime lights, we see that areas with lower initial nighttime lights saw both kind of a larger reduction in both nighttime lights. And then however, we do see that areas with initial higher nighttime lights saw more of a reduction in building damages as reflected in kind of like the Google buildings data set. So both in kind of like the number of buildings and the building height, which could just be a feature of kind of like areas with more initial economic activity, seeing kind of like more buildings. So we potentially see that more captured there. And then these results are showing impacts across a bunch of different time periods. So as you kind of go further down, that's kind of further since the flooding. So we see large reductions in nighttime lights, but we're starting to see kind of like a recovery in later months, kind of getting back towards kind of like baseline of the pre-flooding period. So we especially see that in nighttime lights, and then the activity index, we see kind of like sustained reductions in activity in the impacted regions. And kind of like we showed before, we see more of a reduction in nighttime lights in areas that were had lower initial economic activity, and in some locations that had above median nighttime lights, we do see an increase in nighttime lights and activity as well, which could suggest kind of like people moving into these larger cities during the flooding period. So again, getting a sense for which areas were more impacted and where people kind of like may have moved to during the flooding period. And then beyond overall impacts, we also do an exercise to get a sense for kind of road damage and look at impact on market access of the roads to kind of get a sense for which roads might be prioritized for improvements kind of like improvements during reconstruction efforts. So we're leveraging a growing literature that uses radar data to look at to get a sense for damages. So, I mean, the nice thing about radar, it's an active sensor and it's going to transmit signals kind of like from the sensor and back to the sensor. And the nice thing is it can kind of see through clouds compared to optical data, which is particularly advantageous in a context like this, where we have like flooding that's going to the nature of that is you have like lots of clouds. So it's the particularly advantage for like radar data for this is that it's going to see through clouds that kind of help detect damages. But there's just kind of a growing literature that leverages these kind of like radar pings to look at dynamics kind of before and after different events to get a sense for kind of like changes or damages. So we kind of leverage this literature to get a sense for damages of roads. So first is kind of leveraging the radar data to get a sense for different roads that were experienced damages and some that didn't experience damages, and looking at damages across different class of roads where we see that like damages across different classes of roads, particularly on kind of like these smaller roads of like tertiary, but also numbers of damages along these kind of like larger roads such as motorways and trunk roads too. And then we're able to kind of quantify the impact of road damages on market access to different cities, again, to get a sense for the impact that these road damages had on different towns and locations. So we're able to say, once this road network is out of the network, how does that lead to a reduction in market access for different cities? So the graph on the left is showing the reduction in market access for different cities, which can show which cities may have been more impacted by reductions in or damages from the roads due to flooding. And the right is kind of like showing that overall distribution and change in market access, where some cities were quite heavily affected and some less so. And to get a sense for which roads we might want to kind of target to improve, we use kind of a metric of edge betweenness, which is just kind of a network measure that shows how many shortest paths cross through a road, which gives a sense for the importance of that road. We're able to show here is that roads that were damaged tended to be kind of more important to the network than non-damaged roads. And then we can also use this metric to get a sense for which roads we might want to prioritize fixing, just by seeing which of these roads that were damaged are more central to the network. So here again, just kind of leveraging satellite imagery to detect damaged roads, and then using some of these network metrics to get a sense for the importance of different damaged roads to the network to think about. Again, we just have like extensive damages like this, thinking about how can we use the data to prioritize roads for improvement. So again, that's kind of like, again, a lot of these results are fairly preliminary as we're kind of continuing to move, but I think a couple of the main takeaways is that we kind of leverage these big data sources, especially satellite imagery, which can facilitate looking at impacts of natural disasters using Pakistan as a case study. And then we can leverage these findings to get a sense for the damages and of specific infrastructure like roads, where we can look at impacts on market access and prioritize improvements as well. So thank you so much.
Thanks, Rob, for that. And then Marion, hopefully you're able to share your screen, if not your camera.
Yeah, you should see my screen, and you should also, can you see me
You can
now?
see your screen. That's absolutely fine. You go for it.
Okay. So yeah, good afternoon, good morning, everyone. I'm going to talk to you about using satellite data, but also other sources to measure air quality in data scarce settings, in particular in Senegal. I'm working with as part of a team who's analyzing transport investments' impact on air pollution, and is led by Sveta Milusheva and Bridget Hoffman. And the reason we're looking at air quality is because when we think about green investment and transport infrastructure investment, we're thinking more and more about impacts of these investments on environmental outcomes, such as greenhouse gases emissions and air pollution. And what we're looking at in the context of our project is more specifically the bus rapid transit of Dakar in Senegal. So in general, bus rapid transits are expected to induce modal shifts from private vehicles to cleaner mass transport, and therefore to lead to reduced greenhouse gases emissions and improvements in air pollution in a city. And the car BRT has the additional specificity of being the first BRT operated with 100% electric buses in Africa, which is significantly important for the city because the car is heavily polluted, and therefore there are high expectations for that BRT to have positive impacts on air pollution. So the start of our work is to look at this BRT, however, is not yet operational. So we don't have results to show for the impact of the BRT on air pollution yet. But throughout this work, we've been able to set up a data measurement system and to derive some learning that we think are useful for air pollution monitoring in general. So air pollution, as you know, is a rising concern, both at the global level, with 99% of the population living in areas where air quality does not meet WHO guidelines, but it's also a concern in low and middle income countries, where 89% of the premature deaths caused by ambient pollution occur. So it's really important for policymakers and governments to understand the extent of the air pollution problem, but to do that, they need to measure it. But measuring air pollution is a bit of a challenge, and it's a necessary step to then be able to assess the policies that are implemented to reduce the air pollution problem, such as investment in cleaner transport and such as the BRT. So traditionally, air pollution has been measured using regulatory monitors. These monitors are ground-based instruments that are deployed in networks throughout urban areas and in high-income countries, but they have a high cost to be set up, but also to be maintained. So in urban areas in Africa, there is only one such monitor per 4.5 million residents on average, whereas it's one per 100 to 600,000 residents in Europe and North America. So new sources of air pollution data provide a nice opportunity to lower the cost of acquisition of this data. And these new sources are low-cost consumer-grade monitors and satellite images. And then this data can then be used to evaluate investment in sustainable transport and how pollution changes in relation to these investments. So what I'm going to present to you today is the work that's been done in the context of Dakar, Senegal, which is already innovative in itself because a lot of air pollution analysis has been done, but usually in high-income contexts. And what we did was to compare and evaluate these three sources of air pollution data for policy analysis purposes. What we're looking at more specifically is PM2.5. PM2.5 is a pollutant that's particulate matter of a diameter below 2.5 nanometers. And the reason why we focus on this pollutant specifically is because it is known to be strongly associated with pollution from transport and is linked to important health impacts. I'm going to start by just describing a bit more the three different data sources that are available to monitor air quality. So as I mentioned, there are regulatory monitors. In Senegal, in Dakar in particular, the city is lucky to have 7 stations owned by the government. And these measure the PM2.5 pollutant and a set of additional pollutants. But these stations and these regulatory monitors are very costly to set up and to maintain over time, which translates in our case in very little data being available at any given time. So as you can see on the graph at the bottom, like each color represents a station, and there is a very big discontinuity in the data, and not every station was active at all times all through the last 10 years. But regulatory monitors are the gold standard for policymakers to set regulations, and they are the reference in terms of quality of data. So then what we wanted to do is to complement that regulatory monitor network with lower cost monitors. We used a technology from Purple Air that's around $250 per device, which is much cheaper than the regulatory monitors. And that allowed us to install 26 of them throughout the region to have a finer resolution when we look at air pollution in the area, and to have with a more dense network. The way we picked the location for our network is directly linked to evaluating the impact of the BRT. So we collect data along the BRT route, on the detour routes, spillover areas, and in control areas. What we found by implementing this system is that maintenance is also challenging for these devices. So they have a short lifespan. They usually last about a year. They are like more exposed to security, connectivity, and power issues. And they're required to be calibrated and co-located with regulatory monitors to ensure their accuracy. And finally, we use satellite data to derive estimates of PM2.5 as well, because we found that a typical satellite measure that's used for air pollution analysis, and which is called aerosol optical depth, so AOD, was not performing well in Senegal. And therefore, we used another data product derived from satellite, which is from MIRA-2. And this satellite product gives individual aerosol concentrations. And using a NASA formula, we're able to transform these individual aerosol concentrations in estimates of PM2.5. This data is really nice because it's available freely across the world using Google Earth Engine. It also has a rather fine temporal resolution because it's available at the hourly level, but it's not available at a very fine geographic resolution because it's only provided by squares of 55 by 69 kilometers. So compared to the products that have a 500 meters resolution that were presented in earlier presentations, this is much less granular. So what we first did with these 3 data sources is to compare them and see how they perform. So first, when we compare satellite data to regulatory data, we find that at the daily level, there is a very nice alignment between the PM2.5 data from satellites and the regulatory monitor data. However, at the hourly level, this alignment is less good. So for satellite data, like higher aggregation levels in terms of time are better for accuracy. Then we compare the regulatory data and the low-cost monitor data. And what we see is a bigger difference in levels, because low-cost monitors underestimate the level of pollution due to dust. But what we can do is correct this data using the regulatory local data that is available. And when we apply this correction, we have a much better fit of the data with the regulatory monitor data. So now that we have like a good sense of how these different data sources perform and their like advantages and disadvantages, we're able to also test using them for evaluating transport policies. So as I mentioned, we're not yet able to evaluate the BRT impact, but we were able to look at other transport policies. So we started by looking at the impact of citywide policy. So taking the example of the COVID-19 pandemic natural experiment and the measures that were implemented in Dakar during that period to restrict mobility, with the expectation that the reduction in mobility through like restrictions on public transport, school closures, and so on, had impacts on air pollution. And using a method called the difference in differences, we compared the situation around the start of the policies, which was March 14 in Dakar, to the air pollution level after the policies. And we do that in 2020 and in 2023, so long after the policies were had been revoked. And the graph on the right shows the vertical line shows the date of March 14 when the policy was implemented. And in purple, you see the low-cost monitor data, and in green, the satellite data. And what we see nicely is a drop in air pollution on that graph, but we also see that with impact estimates, what we find is that with the three different data sources, we have a consistent estimate of the impact of the policy at about 25%, but that's for the regulatory and the satellite data, and the low-cost monitor data doesn't match with the other sources. However, when the low-cost monitor data is calibrated using the local regulatory data, we find a similar drop in air pollution due to the policy. So all three data sources provide similar estimates in percent change of the impact of such a policy that's affecting pollution at the city level. What we also wanted to use that for is to compare the calibration of the data, of the low-cost data, using different method and what's providing the best results. So what we saw and what we tested were different off-the-shelf calibration methods with preset formulas, and these calibration methods didn't give very good results. However, when we calibrate the data using local regulatory data or satellite data, we end up with better estimates of the impacts. So what this tells us, and which is really promising, is that when there is no regulatory on-the-ground data available, it's possible to calibrate low-cost monitor data using satellite data. And this is especially important in lower-income cities, because unlike in Dakar, in most urban centers in Africa, there are no regulatory monitoring stations. Because of their high cost, but it's easier to deploy lower cost monitor data systems. So after looking at this citywide policy impact and how the different data sources are able to capture that impact, we also wanted to look at another more spatially concentrated policy intervention, and that's the opening of a bridge on a major road artery in Dakar, and that bridge helps decongest a lot of the roads around it. You can see on the map on the left, the pink dot is where the bridge opened, and all the lines represent road segment where we were scraping data where we were extracting data from Google Maps, using the API to obtain speed on this road segment every 30 minutes. And what we could see was around the date of the bridge opening, increases in speeds and lower congestion, like implying lower congestion. And then when we look at the air pollution data in the same area, we have at the bottom the data from the satellites and the data from our low-cost monitor, because we had a low-cost monitor on the road where the bridge opened. And what we find is that we see a decrease in air pollution at the time of the bridge opening of about 10% using the low-cost air pollution monitors. But we don't see any impact using the satellite data. So what this tells us is it really highlights the importance of having on-the-ground data and a spatially dense network of data points to capture the effect of policies that are spatially concentrated, which satellite data can't do. So in the end, what we find is that one of the most cost-effective way to measure air pollution is combining a low-cost monitor network on the ground with one regulatory-grade monitor, because this allows to have like higher accuracy by correcting the low-cost monitor data, but also higher spatial variations. So you can see on the different maps here, the level of details and the spatial differentiation we can obtain with using each data. And the map in the bottom, in the middle, is data using low-cost monitor calibrated with regulatory monitor. But as I mentioned, in a lot of cities, there is no regulatory data. And in that case, satellite calibration can be also useful, and that's shown on the map on the bottom on the right. So just to conclude quickly, what we find is that satellite data is useful in general to look at larger spatial areas and help understand the trends in air pollution in a city or even in urban areas. But it's not always good enough to capture certain types of investments impacts, but it can be combined with with on-the-ground measurements such as low-cost monitors and regulatory data to just capitalize on the benefits of all of the different data sources. So just to conclude and leave some time for questions, investing in data is key for measuring the effectiveness of the transition to sustainable transport, and investing in data doesn't necessarily mean like hundreds of thousands of dollars, because it can just like newer technologies can be leveraged, such as satellite data and lower cost monitors. So I'm gonna stop here and leave some time for the Q&A.
Thank you. And thank all three presenters. We'll jump to some questions, and since you're the last speaker, Marion, you can go first. The satellite data, is that only useful for picking up on the particular matter, or can it detect any of the other pollutants, or is it very much detecting just the small particulates?
The satellite data?
Yes.
No, it measures other, so it gives different types of pollutants. So we use the formula to aggregate it to obtain PM 2.5, but you can have more details on the different aerosols. So you can separate dust, methane, organic carbon, and so on. But that's specific to the MIRA 2 product. There are other like pollution data sets from satellite sources that provide different pollution information at different temporal and spatial level. We used this one because we found it to be the most accurate in the car when comparing it to regulatory monitors.
Thank you. And then I'll go in reverse. Rob, with the flood actual data, how did you find that compared with, say, the data set that you might get out of JBA with the global flooding models? Like the way the flood occurs versus what some of those big data sets look like. Was it fairly a good match? Or you haven't even looked?
No, yeah, that's a good question. That's something that we should look into a little bit more. We haven't yet, so I can't kind of like speak on the matching. But I mean the data set that we do use for to capture flooding is from Sentinel-1, which is this radar data set. And I mean, I think kind of like the literature on that shows it's like a fairly accurate measure of kind of being able to kind of capture water. I mean, like the downside of Sentinel is it doesn't capture, I mean, it captures data like every few days, but that's kind of like fine in our context when you just see kind of like massive floods happen across like a few month period where there's like more limitations on like flash floods or individual days. So my sense is that we can kind of like fairly trust at least the Sentinel-1 measure of kind of like flood presence. But I think that's a good point that we should kind of compare more to these other models as well. Yeah.
Yeah, like it always just seems to me that we have these models, and it's not so often that we have these massive flood events to be able to say, did the water fall where we thought it would fall, or did it flood to the sort of the way we thought it would? And I'll get into the other people's questions, but I was going back to you, Tillman. One of the things we see in road networks where we end up with not having the high priority roads in the best conditions, and then secondary and then tertiary, is you get that diversion of vehicles onto a lower class road than they ideally should be. And then you end up with, say, your tertiary roads being built to accommodate very few traffic. They end up being better roads than the secondary roads, so all the heavy vehicles divert onto those, destroy this little road. They go back onto the secondary roads, and you end up with this lost opportunity. Does the data set allow us to see that sort of thing? We know it happens, and we've seen it in many countries. Does the data allow us to see that, or is that more the sort of data we get out of the Google APIs and that sort of thing?
I think so. Google APIs are, like we looked into that in our context, but because it's a context where so few people have phones, let alone smartphones, it just doesn't pick up much. But I think the mechanism you're highlighting is really interesting, and we could in principle look at it. We could construct a measure of how well does one of our feeder roads like allow for a detour from a major road, and depending on whether that major road is in a good state or a bad state, how quickly does the smaller road deteriorate? I think like obviously we're not trying to point fingers at like the road authority not building those higher order roads first, because it's a really complex, wicked problem of shocks that occur unexpectedly, and some bridge breaks down and so on, and the budget isn't there. But I think it highlights it highlights how complex it is to build those systems in an efficient order.
Yeah, and a great example of where that happens is in India, where they've got the phenomenal PMGSY program, which is the Prime Minister something or other fund program, one of the biggest road building programs in the world, and it focuses on the tertiary road network. And the federal roads are generally well funded. In some places, the state highway network or the secondary roads are not as good as these little roads which get upgraded, but they've never been built for it. So you get that temporary diversion, then your small roads get destroyed, then everyone goes back and the villages are left with this road which should have lasted for years and instead has lasted for months, and no one wins. So just getting back onto some of these questions here. I guess it's really a question of how easy is it to extend the studies that we've talked about. I guess now you've got the methodologies across all three studies. If you went into East Africa or anywhere else, it's fairly reproducible, I presume, to roll that out for any of you.
I think I can start. Maybe Rob and Marion can chip in. The fascinating thing about satellite data is indeed that you can, in principle, roll it out everywhere. The devil is often, unfortunately, still in the details. Just because, like what I explained or tried to explain with the land cover classification stuff, we could make it work for our context, but it required us to sort of collect local validation data. And I wouldn't want to promise that our approach works just as well in a somewhat different agricultural setting that you may have in other countries, even within the region or within the country. So I know Dime has been really active in trying to provide these public goods. Maybe Rob and Marion can talk a little bit about where that works and where it doesn't.
Yeah, I just kind of speak quickly on ours. I mean, it's kind of Timon was saying. I think devil's often in the details for some of these, especially if you try to kind of like it's easy to often like get the data. It's kind of like trickier to validate. I mean, some like the damage assessment that we did with like the Sentinel-1 data, we took kind of like an existing script that like used that data for damage assessments. So it's something we kind of like leveraged, I think, a public good, but still need to do a bit more into the validation on that. But kind of other metrics that we used, like nighttime lights, are a bit more kind of common in the literature, and that's a bit more, I think, kind of like trusted that we can use. And our team has put out R and Python packages to kind of facilitate getting access easily to this kind of nighttime lights data. It's like public, but sometimes like annoying just to kind of like download and process. So it's this Black Marble R and Black Marble R Python packages that just allows just like super quickly getting that data. Is kind of like an example of public goods that the iConnect team has generated.
Yeah, I think everything that Tillman and Rob mentioned applies in our case as well. Well, it's tricky to use the satellite data, and it, like in our case, it really requires having on the ground validation or other sources, but it's still a very promising like opportunity like for places where there is absolutely no ground monitoring. And similarly to what Rob was saying, we're gonna make everything available like online publicly for reproduction, including our codes. We also have a reproduction kit that we are working on to share on how to use the MIRA2 data for policy analysis, just with easy steps on how to extract it, how to build the indicators and everything.
Okay. There's one question here that due to large pollution like water, air in East Africa, what would be the best strategies to adopt for data collection and satellite data? Anyone quickly got some thoughts on that? I guess we start. You're jumping there, Marion, or anyone else?
So yeah, just quickly, I think the best strategy is first to assess what is available already, and then try to see what gaps there are. Like, so just seeing if there are already institutions doing some monitoring, and what are the gaps, and then satellite data can be useful, but as we all mentioned, it can have some limitations. So for water pollution specifically, I don't really have any information, but for air pollution, that's what I would advise.
I think maybe just to add on that, and perhaps also related to the question that's just below, sometimes different imagery has different strengths. Some imagery is like optical imagery is good for, just seeing the flood as we would see it, like from a plane.
Yeah.
But that's tricky if it's cloudy, as it often is when it rains a lot. So then SAR imagery, like Rob has been using, is particularly useful. And I think the strengths of SAR imagery can also apply in contexts where maybe air pollution is so strong that you cannot actually see stuff in optical imagery. So like I guess we tend to think of satellite imagery as the optical imagery, but there's actually other sensors that can pick up other stuff as well.
Okay, and I'm just going to ask one question, and then the questions we haven't answered, I think Mark has this cunning plan where he can extract those, and we might just get you to answer them online afterwards. But the different methods, I guess, in a way, I was just looking at seasonal accessibility issues we see in many countries. Cambodia, the Mekong floods out, and we lose a road for a period of time. Any one method better than the other to detect those sort of issues that we've got going on from satellites or otherwise?
I mean, something that's really great about satellites is that in principle they have the temporal coverage, or they have coverage over time independent of what happens on the ground, obviously. And some of the imagery that we can use nowadays is so frequent that even things that occur at like shorter timescales than seasonal flooding are able to or can be discerned. So yeah, I mean, detecting flood damage, depending a bit on the scale, but you can probably do that quite well already with sort of the off-the-shelf publicly available imagery like Sentinel-2.
Yeah. Well, I won't keep you any longer. I'll thank all three of you. Thanks the attendees who are on the line still, and we'll give you the virtual clap and let you go. And thanks, Mark and Chris, for the support in the background there. So thank you all, and goodbye.